And this is unsurprising, right? As you will see, it may be serving the literature or looking at the news or reading the news or listening to the news. You'll see that people mean different things when they talk about populism. And this is a fundamental problem when it comes to discussions about populism. Because very often people talk about populism meaning two different things, and they end up, unsurprisingly, not being able to agree. So, what is populism? It appears that populism entails at its core a sort of contradiction, a sort of clash, a moralized clash, that is. On one hand, the people, whatever that might be and however that might be interpreted, against some other force, the elite or the corrupt elite. This clash is, again, moralized. So the people are presented as the pure, the right, the just, against some sort of unjust elite, a corrupt elite, looking out for their self-interest and so forth. So this clash is essentially at the core of any interpretation of populism. I would like to, at least for the purposes of this workshop, to maintain a rather broad understanding of populism. So I am not going to be talking about nativism or other ideologies that might be combined with populist discourses. Instead, what I want to do is maintain this sort of understanding of populism as a thin ideology, let's say, or better yet, a political discourse, some sort of rhetorical device that parties might use. Of course, we cannot dismiss the fact that populism has links to violence or right-wing populism, extreme phenomena that lead to the subversion of democracy and the rule of law and so forth. So we'll be going through this as this talk goes on, but I'd like for you to remember that populism is not necessarily and always that. And I think that these two pictures here represent what we might understand as different facets of populism. On one hand, on the left-hand side, well, as you see, we have a picture from the Occupy movement. For those of you who don't know, the Occupy movement was a rather popular movement in the early 2010s, so 2011, I think it started in New York, where a large number of people occupied Zuccotti Park across the street from Wall Street. Now, this movement, Occupy, was perceived as a populist movement. Why? Because Occupy marched against the corrupt elite. That corrupt elite was, of course, an economic elite, an elite that took advantage of their economic advantage to exert domination and oppression over ordinary people. It's worth bearing in mind that the Occupy movement in 2011 came right after the financial crisis. Right? So you'll hear a lot, and Stephanie, I think, mentioned in her introductory talk, that populism is linked with moments of crisis. And the Occupy movement was one such occasion. When in the aftermath of the financial crisis, we had a social movement embracing this sort of populist ideology. It is worth mentioning that, maybe not for everyone, but a large part of the observers were actually sympathetic to the Occupy movement when it started. And I think that the reason for this sympathy rests on two pillars. The first one was broad non-violence. So Occupy movement, broadly speaking, did not engage with violence. There were some occasions of violence, but in general it was a non-violent movement that proliferated across the world. We had Occupy movement in many, many different countries. And one reason why people were sympathetic was this non-violence, and the second reason was that occupiers people who participated in the Occupy movement, they broadly asked for what were generally perceived as just ends, right? So they were asking for campaign laws regulation, regulating the use of money in politics and so forth. So this is one facet of a populist moment. On the other hand, we have Viktor Orban, right, the leader of Hungary, who is today seen as a paradigm of a populist leader, right? And if you go through the literature and if you go through the news, you'll see that Orban is often linked with attempts to undermine the rule of law or democracy. And this
Okay, so I've joined.
So you can join.
Yes.
You join the course, it was me.
Sorry.
And Hungary is today linked with violations of the rule of law and democracy, as evidenced by the steps the European Union has taken or arguably should take against Hungary. Is there someone who wants to add something or say something at this point? Maybe from people here in the room, or maybe from people following this workshop online? Yeah, so if someone wants to say something, they can simply raise their hands, or they can type in the question in the chat, and we'll read it out loud here. Okay, good. Okay, let's move on. I would mention that it's difficult to pinpoint populism. Well, this is an even taller task, because what is democracy? Well, arguably, since Plato, people disagree about what democracy actually entails, right? If you take any person and ask them, what is democracy? Well, their answer would probably have something to do about people ruling, right? People exercising some sort of political control. That's broadly correct, but it's certainly not sufficient, because then we open the floor to other questions. What does political control entail? Or what are the limits of democracy? What should we understand as democracy? To answer the question of democracy, again, I'd like to refer you to Judge Agis Hajihambisa's paper on the roots of democracy and the way democracy was born and evolved. What I have here is one of my favorite passages from Aristotle's Politics. And the passage says, in polities that are under democracy based on law, popular leaders do not arise. Where the laws are not in authority, however, popular leaders arise. For the people become a monarch, one person composed of many, since the many are in authority not as individuals, but all together. A democracy of this kind is the analog of tyranny among the monarchies. This kind of democracy is not a constitution at all, on the grounds that there is no constitution where the laws do not rule. It's a fascinating piece from Aristotle, and I mean, were we to read this today, we'd think that Aristotle talks about the EU, or he talks about Hungary, or he talks about whatever democracy we've got imagined today, Cyprus, the US. Yes, so there's a lot in this passage. So let's take the time to unpack it a little bit, shall we? So from the outset, Aristotle talks about polities that are under democracy based on law. So we begin with Aristotle recognizing that we can have two types of democracy. On one hand, we can have democracies based on law, and on the other hand, we could have democracies that are not based on law. So, for Aristotle, if you have a democracy based on law, a proper democracy, or what we would say today a constitutional democracy, a democracy where the rule of law is observed, and on the other hand, you could have a democracy that is not guided by principles of the rule of law. And it is against those those democracies of the second variety, where the rule of law does not obtain, that Aristotle goes on to say at the very end here that in this kind of policy, there is no constitution at all, right? It's not just that they are bad democracies, it's that they are not really properly constitutions. If you have a look at Judge Akis paper, you will see how both Plato and Aristotle understand the different constitutions. And both of them are in agreement that in times when a democracy is not mediated by the rule of law, in times where a democracy has no limits, in those times, a democracy is the analog of tyranny, right? So Aristotle says that there's no difference between a tyranny and an unmediated democracy. A democracy of the latter kind is what I would like to call majoritarianism. Right? So we could have, you can see it here on the second point, we could have a democracy that follows the rule of law, or we could have a majoritarian democracy. The kind of democracy where the rule of law is not strictly obtained, it does not strictly obtain. And we will see later where we can draw a link between this kind of majoritarian democracies and populist uprisings when we go back to Aristotle's case. Now, there are two caveats about democracy that I'd like to make now from the outset in order to avoid confusion. The first one is I do not think, and I do not speak of democracy as being an all or nothing concept. So I do not think that we can speak about either having a democracy or not having a democracy. I think that what makes a democracy, and here I speak of democracy in the constitutional sense, is a variety of factors that we should take into consideration when we think about democracy. So we could have stronger democracies and we could have weaker democracies. For example, we could have a well-established democracy running for many, many years that builds a democratic ethos, a culture of democracy. And we can imagine that this state also has sufficient resources, enough money to protect individual freedoms and rights and so forth. And then we can compare this democracy with another democracy that maybe lacks some resources, or maybe it's a new democracy that hasn't had the time to develop this sort of democratic ethos. And when we compare the two, even if they follow similar procedures to make laws, we could confidently say that there's a difference between these two democracies. There's a stronger democracy and a weaker democracy. So the way I understand democracy is to be on a spectrum. We can talk about stronger democracy and we can talk about weaker democracies, and there are a variety of factors that play into this. But this is not the aim of this workshop today. So this is just as a caveat. And the second thing I want to talk about is the first part here. When you read the news, or even when you read academic papers or journals, sometimes you'll see that there's a tendency to speak of a liberal democracy. Yeah? And we do come out and say that we are proud of a liberal democracy. What I want to say now, and I want to draw your attention to this, is that liberalism and democracy can, conceptually speaking, be separated. Right? So if we understand liberalism as a doctrine protecting individual freedoms, right, prizing the individual person, then we could conceptually, right, I don't talk about empirically because then we have other factors coming in, but we can conceptually think of a single person acting as a king, protecting rights for other people. And that person might do a better job in terms of liberalism, protecting individual rights, rather than a democracy that fails in that respect. So conceptually, we can distinguish between the two. The reason why I draw your attention to this is because, as we will see later on, a distinction between liberalism and democracy is something that comes up quite often when we talk, or when we read about populism. Okay, so does anyone want to say something? Does anyone have any questions or a comment or something that they'd like to say, either here or on Microsoft Teams, or shall I just proceed? Yeah, good. Okay.
Here's a question.
Yes.
Yes. Dear Professor, I
Not
have
a
a
professor,
question.
but a cake.
Sorry?
Not a professor, but a cake.
Okay. Dear lecturer, I have a question. The concept of democracy is multifaceted. But what model of democracy, one of its regime of pluralism, would you consider today as a way out of a complex, collapsing political and economic situation? What model? We can keep this for later.
Sure. I mean,
We have
we
enough,
can save it for later.
Do we have enough information now to engage?
Well,
in such a...
that's the thing. The question is quite complicated. For two reasons. First, it's not clear to me if the question is about actual systems that we can point. So we want to say, okay, the democracy of Scandinavian countries, for instance, or the democracy of the US. So I'm not sure if the question is about an actual democracy, a historical democracy, let's say,
Yes.
or if it's a normative question about the concept of democracy.
Christina, could you type in the chat, sub-questions? Are you referring to something that is theoretical or actual examples? Or should we address it at the normative level or not?
Because if it's a question about the normative level, then I will have more to say about this later on when we discuss remedies or possible remedies for the populist uprising.
There is no sub-question for the moment. Let me continue.
Okay, but I mean, let me say something about the historical component. It's extremely difficult to point to democracies today and say, okay, this is a democracy that works. The reason is because whatever factors or standards you use will be subject to contestation. People always say, why do you use this standard and how do you understand this standard and so forth. In broad political terms, I can refer you to several indexes that measure factors like freedom of expression, for instance, in a country, or they measure wealth and resources that permit protection of individual rights. So, for example, The Economist has a list coming out every year, I think, or maybe every 2 years or 3 years, where they list democracies based on their strength, on their capacity to protect freedom of expression and political expression. So that would be a way to look at historical examples of democracy that actually work. That is not to say, of course, that those democracies are perfect, right? One of the things that I want to raise today is that no matter what kind of democracy we have, it is never perfect, because democracy, as Judge Hachikam says in his own paper, comes with the seeds to its destruction, let's say, right? The sheer fact that you have a democracy will always leave the door open for non-democracy. And we'll speak more about that in a minute. Shall we proceed? Yeah? Okay, so what are we going to discuss today? The first thing I want to talk about is the relationship between democracy and populism. And I want to examine whether populism always and in principle undermines democracy and the rule of law. The second thing I want to discuss is the sort of structural flaws of a democracy that give rise to populist uprisings. And the third thing I want to discuss are potential ways to stymie populist uprisings. This is the sort of remedies that I've alluded to earlier. So, populism and democracy. It is quite clear that populism has a strong link with democracy, right? Populism, the idea we the people, or the people, the strong people, the pure people, and so forth, draws from the concept of popular sovereignty, which is basically the philosophical foundation of a democracy. That people ought to be in charge. They ought, they should rule. They should exercise political control. So from the outset, we can see that populism and democracy are very closely linked. And if we go back to the Occupy movement that I started out at the beginning, one of the reasons why the Occupy movement was rather well received, at least at the beginning, right? Because later on, people started becoming annoyed by the inconvenience that the movement caused. But at least at the beginning, the reason why it was people looked at it sympathetically was that it sort of expressed certain legitimate concerns, right? If we're talking about a democracy, then we should be concerned about popular interests. We should be concerned about what people think. We should pay attention when people speak. And some populist movements, or even parties, they could be understood as a way of saying, listen harder. We have some legitimate interests here that have been ignored or have been marginalized or have not been taken into account by the democratic lawmaking process. So here they are. In this sense, populism could enhance inclusion. It could improve democracy by proliferating the number of discourses that make their way into the legislative procedure. And here I have a quote from Thomas Goodwin. Granted, the book was written a while back when populism had a quite different meaning. But what Goodwin says is that populism was democracy's sin. Essentially, it was that moment when people finally expressed their views, right? So this is, what I have here is kind of a positive spin on populism, right? I'm not saying that populism enhances democracy. What I'm saying is that under certain understandings of populism, it could be seen as contributing to democracy, at least to some extent. But not everything is so flowery. So upon closer inspection, we can identify certain problems with populism and democracy. If we go back to the very first sort of very brief and cursory definition of populism I've provided as the clash between the demos and the elite, the people, right? The first question that jumps to mind is, well, who is the demos? Who are those people that are supposedly represented in this clash, or better yet, not represented, maybe embodied in this clash against the corrupt elite? Once we start talking about the demos, we could probably reveal a darker side to populism. Because it is at this point that many populist movements, many right-wing populist movements, start talking about something like nativism or ethnic distinctions between the people and the others. And this is where we have maybe the targeting of minorities as those who are outside the demos and so forth. I'm not spending too much time on this because I understand in the next, today and tomorrow we'll have experts talking about this idea to a greater extent, but it's worth bearing in mind that populism may and often does lead to those kind of exclusionary discourses. And here we can contrast the exclusionary facet of populism with the inclusive facet of populism that I discussed earlier on, where it is a way to bring in discourses into the democratic procedure. And when we start talking about the demos, the people, right? One question that arises is, what does the demos want? And this this is a question at the heart of democratic theory. Right? So you have, if you're someone like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for instance, his idea of the general will, right? It's exactly this question. What do the people want? How can we give flesh and bones to this popular will, right? And once we start talking about the popular will, more problems seem to arise. Because suppose that for some reason we come up with an understanding of what the people want. Yeah? What happens with dissent? Or what happens to people who disagree? If, as I mentioned at the very beginning, the demos is this moralized component, right? Who is right and correct. Anyone going against the popular will is essentially a traitor, right? There's no dissent allowed. If we're talking about a general will expressed by the demos, then we must talk about the possibility of everyone else who disagrees with whatever, with that perceived notion of the popular will, everyone else will become a traitor, right? And here we should also point out that in populist movements, it is very often the case that we have a charismatic ruler, right? Someone who alleges that they embody the people. They speak for the people, right? And here I'd like to very, very briefly mention Max Weber, right? Max Weber, the social scientist who spoke about grounds of legitimacy, right? Essentially, why someone ought to rule, to have a right to rule. And one of the grounds of legitimacy that Max Weber recognizes is charismatic legitimacy. A person who has such charisma that is able to make people follow them. And in the case of populist movement, that charismatic leader is the leader who speaks for the people, embodies the popular will, right? And so, going back to my second point here, anyone going against that leader essentially goes against the popular will. So again, dissent is at a premium when we talk about populist movements. Now let's follow from this picture of a charismatic leader expressing the general will, the will of the demos, the will of the people. And let's imagine cases where that leader expressing the will of the people tries to enact a change, a legal change. Say that they want to change some law, right? Suppose that the leader wants to change a law saying that, let's see, it is permitted for the president to rule for 4 consecutive terms. Why? Because the leader knows what the people want, the people want stability, so we want the president ruling for 4 consecutive terms. Incidentally, that's not a science fiction scenario, yeah? We've seen cases around the world where this happens. So imagine this case where the leader says that, okay, I'll change the law so that I can be the president for 4 consecutive terms. Constitutions typically have protections against such changes, right? So we have rule of law constraints, limits, saying this you can do and this you cannot do, right? So in this scenario, we have a showdown between, on one hand, the popular will, what the people want, represented by the leader, and rule of law constraints that prevent the leader from acting in a particular way. So the huge question about populism is what happens when we have the alleged expression of the popular will, right? The will of the demos, the will of the people, clashing with rule of law constraints. And this is where I want to go back to Aristotle, right? Because Aristotle understands that if you have a democracy without rule of law constraints, then you end up with a tyranny. So the rule of law constraints are precisely there so as to prevent cases where the unmediated will of the people will try to act in certain ways, right? And I draw your attention to this last sentence here. This kind of democracy, i.e. the democracy without rule of law protections, is not a constitution at all, on the grounds that there is no constitution where the laws do not rule. So if we have a leader who wants to be a president for 4 terms and can simply push through this legislative agenda, Aristotle will come out and say, okay, what you have here is not a constitution. You don't have a constitution, you have the will of a person. Of course, if you look at it from the populist perspective, right, a populist might say, but that's not the will of a single person, right? No, it's the will of the people. And this is where the fundamental problem of populism lies, especially when it comes to democracy. Okay, do we have any comments or questions or anything? Yes, please.
Yes, so that's very interesting. So the rule of law, can you go back to the previous slide?
Aristotle's quote.
Yes, so the rule of law in this case is taken literally as meaning that the laws rule or do not rule.
Yes, so that's a very good point. I should have clarified this. So when Aristotle talks about the rule of law here, I think in book 4, it's because he distinguishes between rule of persons and rule of law, right? So the fundamental distinction for Aristotle is cases where you have a single person issuing law and cases where you have laws ruling, i.e. laws setting up procedures about things ought to be decided. So when Aristotle here talks about the rule of law, that's a very good point, Stephanie, it's because Aristotle wants to tell us that when you don't have the rule of law, you have the rule of persons. When you have the rule of persons, you leave the door open to arbitrary domination and deprivation of freedom. Yes? You want to say something?
Yes, so.
I'm sorry, could you speak up,
Yes,
because we want to make sure that other people hear that.
The example of the leader
Yes.
going to change the law. In the cases we know, we see that that leader is charismatic, controls the rule of law that can change according to his will.
Exactly.
Not the will of the people at the end of the day.
Yes,
Not to become a leader for 20 or 30 years.
exactly. Yes. So this is exactly what.
The rule of law exists, but this leader controls the means to change the rule of law. So where is populism, democracy?
The distinction dissolves essentially. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And I think what we should point here is that, again, maybe it's we're getting a little bit too philosophical for what we want to say now, but well, there you go. We can talk about different perceptions of the rule of law, right? So someone like Joseph Raz, for instance, would talk about a thin understanding of the rule of law, where the rule of law is essentially a tool, right? A tool to increase efficiency, right? So someone like Raz would say, yes, principles like generality or having laws being prospectively pronounced and promulgated and so forth, right? What we understand to be standards of the rule of law. Someone like Raz would say, of course, this is the rule of law, and this is important, not intrinsically, so it doesn't have value in and of itself, but it has value insofar as it's a tool. It's a knife that has both ways. That's the analogy he uses, right? So for us, you could have a populist regime that uses the rule of law to establish certain populist agendas, right? And I think I have a couple of slides later on where I discuss this point. But it's very interesting to consider how the different understandings of the rule of law would lead to different interpretations of events. Yeah? Because perhaps you can take, on the other hand, we could have strong perceptions of the rule of law, right? So essentially, like someone like Brian Kamanaha builds on what Ron Fuller used to say, and he says that yes, we do have rule of law principles, but those principles are also morally good because they presuppose maybe individual agency or freedom of the individual, and maybe they're linked with democracy and so forth. So if we look at the rule of law in that way, then we can't really say that, okay, the populists will take advantage of the rule of law. We would say that there is no rule of law to take advantage of in that scenario. Does it make sense? I think there was a hand up there, or?
No.
No? Okay. Does anyone else want to say anything or add something to this? Or can we proceed? Yeah? Please.
I wanted to ask
Please
about.
speak up, because I'm not sure if people can.
That's right. I wanted to ask about the Constitution. Usually, the democratic constitutions prevent you to change material points of the governance, so that the person that actually is the president or the prime minister of a country cannot manipulate the constitution for their own benefit. However, if the government manipulates the rest of the legislation, they can actually achieve that without without contravening the constitution. How can we prevent this from happening?
You can't. The short answer is you can't, because think of a constitution, right? My question to you would be, where does the constitution derive its legitimacy, right? Why should I obey the Constitution of Cyprus, for instance? Or why should I obey any constitution, for that matter, right? Response for that could vary, right? So you could have people saying, well, the existence of a constitution is justified on democratic terms, popular sovereignty. Or some people might say, no, it's justified in terms of individual rights. A constitution is legitimate insofar and to the extent that it protects individual rights. So you could have a lot of different interpretations of the legitimacy of the constitution. But my question would be, okay, let's say we have a constitution, yeah? And let's say that we want to change it. How can we change the constitution? This is a question that John Austin tried to answer. Try to find who can change the constitution, and they are the sovereign.
Well, in Cyprus specifically, the actual constitution cannot be changed, technically.
Yes.
However, due to the situation with the occupation and everything, the constitution was forced to change with the law of necessity, thank you, Stephanie, because of the way the constitution was structured. So we have a political situation that changed this.
Good. I think we were talking past each other, because you are talking about the legal aspect of changing the constitution, right? I'm talking about the political or moral aspect of changing the constitution. So in a moral sense, you can change the constitution if the entire people come together and say, okay, we don't like this constitution, we want a new one, right? That's how revolutions work. Right? We don't want this one, we want another one. So you always have the question of, where does the constitution derive its legitimacy? Legitimacy not in a legal sense, but in a moral sense or political sense, essentially. But to go back to your initial question, you will always have this problem, because it comes with democracy. And this is what people mean when they talk about a democracy coming with the ways to undermine it, right? And this is reminiscent of the free speech debate. In a democracy, you have to allow free speech, but what about speech that is against democracy? Should you allow a speech that is against democracy? If you negate that, then you are acting undemocratically, but you do that in order to safeguard democracy, and then you have a kind of a vicious cycle. Okay, any other questions or comments before we proceed? Good. Okay, so causes of populism. I do not want to spend much time on this because these are well rehearsed and you'll hear about this a lot over these 2 days. So Stephanie talked about times of crisis. One such crisis that we had quite recently was the financial crisis and the concomitant austerity measures. Why did the financial crisis lead to this rise of populism? Well, you have people who lost their jobs. People who lose their jobs are typically and unsurprisingly unhappy. People who didn't lose their jobs, they had their wages slashed, or they were forced to work really long hours to make up for those let go. So this this type of unhappiness, of discontent, is what drives dissatisfaction with the established order, right? And in the case of the financial crisis, it's essentially what allowed the populist rhetoric to target a specific class, right? Because if we have a financial crisis and we have a collapse of the financial system and you have a government that bails out banks, for instance, or they give money to restructure the economic sector that many argue collapsed because of its own fault and so forth and so forth. People who see that, who see the help given to banks or the economic elite, but not given to ordinary people, regular people, people who lose their jobs, people who are forced to live off benefits and so forth and so forth, then this gives the populist parties a clear target and a clear line of rhetoric. Every populist party can come out and say, you are the ordinary people who lost their jobs, who suffered because of the financial crisis. You're also the people who are left out. You're left behind by the legal order. You are the people that have been oppressed by the elite for many years and now suffer again because the elite stands above you. The elite, the banks, the bankers, the economists, you know how it's all too familiar, this line of rhetoric, right? I'm not saying that it's entirely unjustified, right? What I'm saying is that this is the sort of rhetoric used by populist parties. I do not want to underplay the socioeconomic causes of populism. If you have a look at Judge Akis Hajikambisa's paper, when he speaks about the evolution and the coming of age of democracy in ancient Athens, he talks about Solon, right? Solon, the legendary Athenian lawgiver, the person who restructured Athens and set the foundations for democracy, later built on by Christians and so forth. But when Judge Hajikambiz talks about Solon, he also praises Solon because Solon was able to identify the causes of discontent in Athens. Those causes were essentially socioeconomic causes. It was because ordinary people, ordinary Athenians, were allowed to borrow money upon security of their body. So they became slaves because they couldn't repay their debts. Right? So you have someone like Solon recognizing that this is the fundamental problem with Athens. And what Solon did was, of course, he deleted all the debts and he prohibited the practice of borrowing money upon security of your own body. Right? And Judge Hajikambiz looks at that to say that when we have this sort of deep socioeconomic inequality, bold measures need to be taken, as we will see later on when we look at the different, the various remedies that he proposes. So I do not want to underplay this important reason of discontent by the people. And this is related to the first factor. Here we can talk about economic uncertainty, right? It's one thing to lose your job, it's another thing to not be able to think of your future. You're not able to think ahead, you're not able to plan. When you don't have a job, when there's this sort of uncertainty because of increased unemployment, then people are unable to live their lives, right? And this feeds into the feeling of discontent I have been describing so far. One major point that populists want to make, as we can see here from the picture I've chosen, is to speak of migration. Now, one way in which populists portray migration as a flaw of current systems is that migration increases competition for the job, right? If you paid attention to this guy over here, more often than not, he used to talk about foreigners coming to take our jobs. That's how he used to put it, right? And combining the financial crisis and the aftermath of the crisis with economic uncertainty and this sort of rhetoric, they come to take your job, they come to replace you, right? You can see why populism has grown exponentially over the last decade, right? It's not that populism wasn't there, right? Of course it was there, and a country like France knows all too well that it's been there, right? It's that since the crisis, all of this has grown, right? What I want to stress today, however, is that I think it's a mistake to simply point to the crisis and say this was the reason of the populist uprising, and therefore by, I don't want to say fixing, because we all know that some things cannot be fixed, but kind of masking these problems or putting them away, out of sight, out of mind, as they say, right? If we show an increased GDP, for instance, or if we start showing decreased rates of joblessness, of unemployment, I do not think that by doing that, we are doing anything substantially to stymie populist uprisings. I think that this is simply misunderstanding the foundational reasons why populism has taken root, especially in Europe at this time and age. Yes, please.
I cannot but just say what I'm thinking now. What I would like to really understand is there is the opposite of the populist message for migrants and taking our jobs, or taking money from the income schemes or whatever. Why these favoring reasons were not as populist in the last decade, let's say, in Europe, and not only in Europe, I mean, in the States, someone can say, because, that's what we should answer, actually.
I think that's an
I
excellent.
get what country democracy and the
yes, so I myself have a theory of democracy, so my answer will definitely come back to democracy. And I would say that the reason why one rhetoric won over the other, because that's essentially the problem here, right? As you point out, yeah, the same way we have this sort of right-wing populist rhetoric of migrants taking your jobs, you also have a more, let's say, I want to be politically correct here, a more nuanced, probably that some might object to that word, but a more nuanced rhetoric of they're fleeing war, for instance, let's see how we can help them. Or they are not coming to take your jobs, they are doing jobs that you don't.
European Union that needs
Yes,
support
exactly. And yes, exactly.
An argument is not.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And facts today seem to support your view, right? Because if you look at a country like the UK, since we have dear old Nigel here behind me, a country like the UK that needs European labor to support institutions like the NHS, for instance. My opinion, and that's the only thing I can provide, is that the reason why one sort of discourse wins over another is because we have fundamentally flawed democracies that give rise to democratic discontent, and we have people mistakenly thinking that this sort of democratic discontent can be remedied by turning to populism. That's what I would say. And I want to stress here, I'm not saying mistakenly in the sense of accusing them, right? Because they rightly feel this sort of discontent against democracy. And it's up to democracy to show them that this discontent is justified and we can fix it, right? So I think what we have here is essentially a really smart ploy by far-right populist parties who take advantage of a legitimate discontent with democracy to push through certain rhetoric, certain discourses playing on the pathos of people, essentially. That's what I think. And I mean, of course, I invite everyone to offer their own perspectives, because I think that this is essentially the question at the heart of every debate about populism. Why did it happen? Yeah. Why do we have, and you know, that's another huge mistake, is to think of people who support these populist movements as, you know, crazy people, or people who lost their minds, or violent people, and so forth. Because those populist movements, the reason why they rose to power is because they were supported by ordinary people who felt democracy's discontent. Right?
Can I ask a question, because you use the word populist. So
the word?
Populist.
Ah,
yes.
Yes.
As an adjective. Yes, yes. Yes, I did. So I am a bit, especially when I was reviewing submissions for the journal, I have seen that there is perhaps a confusion in the terminology between people, popular, and populist. Maybe we need to think about this. So what you are talking about here is the people's will, which is perhaps not the same as the popular will or the populist will.
Yes. I mean, one very common populist plot
Yes.
is to conflate different wills, right? Yes. So the will of the people becomes the populist's will, right? And this, you can see it very often. I mean, I'm not a sociologist myself, but sociologists who examine the way populist parties leaders talk, they've identified this sort of, and they can be very subtle, right? They can change from one sentence to the next. You can start in one sentence and talk about the popular will, and then the next sentence it becomes the populist will, right? Because it's very subtle the way in which these sort of different wills are used by populist parties. And I think it's because when we talk about the popular will, it carries with it some sort of moral legitimacy, right? Yeah. Because the popular will is the will of the people. That's what democracy is, right? So in colloquial terms, when we talk about the democracy, we talk about what the people want, or the people ruling. And
then we do have a charismatic leader that she preempts the will of the people.
Exactly.
And manipulates the people into coming toward the leader charismatically.
So there are two things to note here. One is what the leader says, which is simply, I embody the will of the people. I am the will of the people. Right? So that's how a populist, charismatic leader would speak, right? And then the second thing is what you, I think, very accurately put, preempting the will of the people, right? Because once the populist leader becomes the manifestation of the people, then what the people thinks no longer matters, right? It doesn't matter because if you want to know what the people think, just ask this guy, right? If you go back in history, find someone like Hitler, for instance, and famous Führer principle, right? The idea that whatever the Führer says, that's the representation of the popular will, right? That's exactly the sort of thing going on when we start talking about populist movements. Okay, does anyone else want to say something? Yes?
Just a small comment that you mentioned people are unhappy with the situation.
Mm-hmm.
This is when it's easier to be manipulated, and that's why the populist leaders play with this situation. Because if someone is unhappy, he needs or she needs to blame the problems somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they offer, a scapegoat.
No, well, that's absolutely right? And this is the idea of demagoguery, right? The idea of swaying people to whatever you think. And that's a fundamental trait of the charismatic leader, because the charismatic leader is able to help people flow to their own positions, whatever those may be. And the reason why, going back to your question, why do people flow to their position? Well, it's because they're discontent and they have certain problems, they have certain concerns, justified concerns, and they turn to populist parties for answers. Okay, does anyone else want to say something before we proceed? Okay, so let's see. We've talked about several reasons why people might feel unhappy about their constitutions. And what I want to do now is look at systemic problems of democracy. Problems that are always there because of democracy and which give rise to discontent. I should point that I don't think it's possible to divorce these sort of structural faults of democracy from the socio-economic mistakes that I talked about earlier, right? Because I think that these systemic problems give rise and they feed and they allow to proliferate all those socioeconomic problems that we've touched earlier. And in a minute, you'll see why it will be quite clear, right? So, the first question that I want to ask is, why is democracy appealing, right? Why do we, well, I'd like to assume that people like democracy, they want democracy, right? You don't find a lot of people going out in the streets saying, we want more tyranny, right? Although, I mean, maybe there are some who do, maybe covertly, but people generally find democracy appealing, right? Why do people find democracy appealing? Because democracy, if we reduce it to a very basic principle, is that the people are in charge. The people exercise control. Now, of course, we can start arguing about what control entails, what kind of control, and so forth. But the basic principle remains. And the reason why we can talk about democratic legitimacy, right? Legitimacy, again, being the idea that it is right to obey democratic decisions. It's correct. They have some sort of quality that binds us, right? A decision by a democracy is different from a decision by a tyrant. One warrants respect, the other not so much, right? And the reason why this is the case is because democracy is a constitution that gives people opportunities. It gives them opportunities to participate in politics. I've mentioned earlier freedom of speech, which I think is the fundamental element of a democracy. The ability to speak is what makes a democracy. Voting is an expression of speaking. It's an expression of will. So, democracy is a constitution or a form of government that is appealing because it allows people to rule themselves, to govern themselves, and therefore it allows them to be free. When people are governed by others without exercising any control over them, they are unfree. They do not enjoy freedom, right? So this is the fundamental reason why democracy is appealing, because it gives people, citizens, as I say here, opportunities to participate in decision-making processes and contribute to the making of laws. Very often, however, the picture is not as rosy as I've described, right? So it's not always the case that people are happy when they live in a democracy because they can participate in the making of laws. And here I have, it's probably one of my favorite quotes in the entire populist literature, where populism is described as an illiberal democratic response to undemocratic liberalism. First of all, I'd like to say that I don't really agree with this statement.